Good evening, good afternoon. My name is Milo Vassallo. I am the moderator this evening of a very special event. What you just watched was a powerful capture of American history, American democracy, many of its failings, and also especially under siege. Our event this evening is actually going to include two of the people who helped create that film, that captured that history for us, as well as someone very engaged in press freedom. My name is Milo, the executive director of the Media Democracy Project, and I am part of a team that is building an activist community that is mobilizing and empowering people across the country to take actions in support of a better informed America. What we just saw in terms of American democracy, some of its failings that have been from its foundation, are not only going to be solved. We were watching in the chat comments about Supreme Court reform, electoral reform. There's going to need to be an intentional effort to reform media and press, and specifically to support press freedom. I'm going to start with three little topics very briefly to set the stage for our panelists, and I'll introduce them shortly. But there's a concept that we think a lot about in the Media Democracy Project called media capture. How information is controlled by a finite number of people or systems. By definition, media capture primarily refers to a system of corruption where powerful entities such as governments and oligarchs control media institutions to shape news coverage, suppress criticism, and serve vested interests other than the public. A perfect example of that for informed folks is what has happened in the last year to CBS under the thumb of the Ellison family. The demolition of 60 Minutes, the destruction of CBS News, the firing of multiple veteran journalists. That is a classic and typical example of an extreme example of media capture. We're going to talk tonight with three panelists who've experienced impacts of media capture in other ways that tie into democracy under siege. So without further ado, I want to introduce three incredible panelists, three incredible humans that really are fighting the fight for a better informed America in the work they do. Starting with Laura Nix, who is the director of the film that you just watched. She's a writer, producer. She has been an Academy Award nominee. She's won a Peabody Award. And also she's been engaged specifically in the executive committee of the documentary branch of the documentary Emmys. So she's engaged in her community, and it's important as we think about our roles in society that people do more than just their primary task, if they can do more. And it's fascinating to see that our panelists here are engaged in work beyond their primary work. Next, Ann Telnaes is an incredible editorial cartoonist, various mediums, sketches and print. She's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for her editorial cartoons in 2001, 2020, 25. She's won the Herb Block Award for editorial cartooning. Some of her background, which is very relevant to her incredible talents and her creative skills. She studied at the California Institute of Arts. She graduated with a BFA. And she herself is also a past president of the Association of American Editorial Cartoonists and is a longtime ardent press freedom advocate. We're also joined by Seth Stern. He's the chief of advocacy at the Freedom of the Press Foundation. Seth's articles on press freedom have been published in The Guardian, The Intercept, and before joining Freedom of the Press Foundation's advocacy team, he was a practicing media and First Amendment lawyer for 13 years. An incredible panel joining us this evening to talk about integrating the concept of democracy, media, and media capture. I want to start by introducing Laura, or giving Laura the mic to start us off. Laura, this film is powerful. I've seen it multiple times. Each time it's just captures so much of what we've lived, so many of the failings of American democracy. Tell us about the origins of this film. Why did you make it? Who got to watch it? And please and share with us.
Sure. I made the film in 2024. It was finished before the election, obviously, and it was broadcast to over 1 million people in Europe. It was made entirely with European funding for the European broadcaster Arte. I made it with a Belgian production company with money from Germany and several other countries in Europe. And it's part of a series called Draw for Change, which is 6 different episodes of women filmmakers working with female cartoonists around the world on issues that are important in their country. And I was asked to direct the U.S. episode. And I was introduced to Ann, and we got on a call to talk about how we might do a film about the Supreme Court, because I wanted the issue that I wanted to focus on to be the Supreme Court. And Ann has done a lot of work about the Supreme Court and its issues. And we started speaking before the pandemic. Actually, we started talking about it a really long time ago, and we couldn't raise enough money for that film, and we tried to give the money back to Arte and say, we can't figure out how to make this film for the budget that you've got, and we need to do more. And they said, no, we need to have something about your election. Can you explain what the crisis in U.S. democracy is to Europeans? And I was like, I can try. It's pretty complicated. And the main thing is that it can't just be about Trump, because I really believe that Trump is the symptom and not the cause. We've got a lot going on that's baked into our Constitution, into our structural formation. And if you're open to a film that can look at that, then I think we could do that. And I talked with Ann about it, and we both were challenged by that idea, but interested in that idea. And so then we set off to make the movie, and I think I made the whole thing in 8 months from start to finish, and had the gift of working with Ann's cartoons, because there's a lot of kind of dense material to get through, and Ann's cartoons make it easier for the medicine to go down, and it makes it easier to understand these really complex topics. And I think adding humor to issues like this is really important. And being able to work with Ann on the film was just a gift and an honor. Oh, Milo, I can't hear you.
I muted myself. That's it. Inevitably, it happens on every meeting, right? So thank you for that summary, and exactly right. Ann, to introduce Ann, your work is well known outside of the film. Please speak to your participation, how you perceive the film, and your process on the film itself.
Yeah, as Laura said, we've been working on this a long time. It was as she mentioned, prior to COVID, and I never thought it would be made, just because of all the problems with raising funds. But once I heard that that we were going to do basically a documentary kind of explaining to the European audience about our system, our election system, I thought, well, that's really interesting, and to be honest with you, I learned so much just during this film that I did not know, probably a lot like the audience didn't know. I mean, it was a surprise to me about certain things, the Electoral College and just everything that's kind of baked in to make things not work. So that was really interesting to me. This was, as Laura mentioned, this was done in 2024, before the re-election of Trump. I have to be honest, I was hopeful, and I thought, well, I'm really glad that he's not going to be president again, but this is not going to be relevant anymore, this movie, once we go on, which I was happy about. But now it is very relevant. It still shocks me when I watch it about where we are and everything that, the commentators that were saying, the other people that were talking in the film, what was going to happen. And we are there. We are in an autocracy, and we are losing press freedoms all the time. And that's really dangerous. So I'm grateful that Laura did this. It's definitely a timing that we didn't plan on, but here we are. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you, Ann. And Seth, if you'd kind of tell folks who are not familiar with the Freedom of the Press Foundation does, and your work there, and potentially tie it to this democracy under siege that we've just been discussing.
Sure. Well, first of all, great to be here and honored to be in the company of all of you. So Freedom of the Press Foundation, we are a nonprofit organization that defends and protects press freedom. Our name is intended to be descriptive. We do advocacy work on the policy front, on the legislation front. We also operate the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, which is a database that monitors press freedom violations, assaults of journalists, arrests of journalists, subpoenas of journalists, gag orders, prior restraints against journalists, and an ever-expanding other category where we put all the stuff happening now that nobody had ever anticipated. We also operate and develop a tool called SecureDrop, which is a whistleblower submission portal, increasingly important these days, to allow whistleblowers to provide documents to journalists as untraceably and confidentially as current technology allows. And we conduct digital security training for journalists because technology isn't without its faults, but is in better shape than the law right now when it comes to encryption. So that's some of what we do. Now, historically, on our advocacy side, we've been rights focused. We have been really concerned with the law, concerned with legal limits on journalists' ability to do their work, interpretations of the First Amendment by the courts that were threatening to journalists, statutory protections being lost or weakened. The thing with the First Amendment, though, is it assumes that the press is going to want to avail itself of those legal protections. The First Amendment has this weakness that we're seeing more and more now. It really doesn't contemplate a situation where a David Ellison or a Jeff Bezos comes into a room with the president and says, we want a merger done. You want favorable coverage. Let's scratch each other's backs. Let's make a deal. Where First Amendment rights are sort of put on the table as a bargaining chip for billionaires to either get richer or expand their influence, because I have doubts that the Ellisons really intend to get richer off of this transaction. They're paying an absurd price to acquire Warner Brothers. I don't think it's good for their shareholders or their businesses. I think it's good for their sphere of influence. So we're in sort of new constitutional territory, and that's caused us at FPF to pivot to an extent, because this isn't just about the legal protections that exist on paper anymore. This is about capture, as you said.
Great. Thank you for that incredible work. And we're going to drop links during the chat, and and specifically of all the panelists and the Freedom of the Press Foundation. I personally, Seth, have used something that we never naively, I think there are many things people were naive about the state of American democracy and its imperfections, but that there is actually the collection of all the assaults on press freedom, journalists that you folks maintain. It's really, it's tragic but spectacular that someone is doing that in the United States. I know, Ann, we're going to talk about press freedom shortly, but as a subject matter in a couple minutes. But that press freedom tracker in the United States, that is, and that the folks at the Freedom of the Press Foundation are actually documenting that is very helpful for everyone. So now let's move on to that subject that I mentioned of media capture, and all three of our panelists this evening have directly encountered media capture or the impacts of media capture. I'd like to start with Laura about this film itself and kind of distribution. The obvious question for probably everyone on this panel is, or in the audience, why didn't every American get to see this in 2024 or before the election? Like, why was this only available to Europeans better understanding America? Why not Americans? What are your thoughts on how that might tie in?
Well, something that's happened in general in the film industry is basically, I'll just radically simplify it by saying, like, the tech bros took over Hollywood and they broke it. And we're dealing now with like a broken media system that was highly influenced by certain tech interests getting engaged with it. And that's led to a great commercialization of the nonfiction field. A lot of nonfiction was being made in a public media landscape in the interest of in public interest and informing people about what you need to know to be a participating civic actor. And you've seen a gradual, there's always been an attack on public media. They've been threatening to, do a lot of things against that for a long time. But there was also, as Timothy Snyder would say, a lot of people obeying in advance. And even before the election, you saw public media backing away from a certain type of political content that they would not put on public television. There's no way. I mean, I've had many, many films on public television, on POV especially. And, one of my first jobs I ever worked at was at Frontline. I mean, I'm like a filmmaker who comes from that space, and we couldn't get them to touch a film like this. And that's because they were worried, I think, about what might happen in the future with public television. And in fact, that became true, right? The fear that he would take control over the administration is exactly what happened. But you're seeing a kind of, there's much fewer outlets to be able to sell our films to. And sadly, there was a kind of corporate censorship that was happening before he was elected. Most of the platforms are looking for nonfiction material that's based in celebrity, true crime, scandal, cult. Ironically, there's a great way to talk about this administration through those avenues, because that's exactly what we're dealing with, is those four, but that's not what they're looking for. That's not the brand of celebrity, true crime, and cult that they're actually looking for. So that's where the money is. And it was always very hard to get a certain type of doc funded and made and distributed, but it became even more impossible. Then he was elected, right? And then it was like, forget it. Like, there's absolutely no way. Then he dismantled the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is the biggest he canceled all the grants for people. That was the largest source of public funding for nonfiction films in the country. And they've dismantled public television. And now there's like this gutting of all the nonfiction threads, all the nonfiction channels that we've been relying on for years. They're all just being gutted. And I think we have to imagine a world, what would it be like if we didn't have access to political documentaries in the US? Because that's where it's going. And my last film was made with Europe. My next film probably will be too, because if you're trying to make a certain kind of content, it's very difficult to get that. Even philanthropic funding is drying out because the funders, they're funding movies. This is private soft money, right? It's funding movies that's going to get films completed, and those films are going to Sundance, winning awards, can't get distribution. It's dire. I can't tell you how dire it is. It's really bad. So that's all related to a media capture, right? It's a way that a certain type of content is not available to the public.
Thank you for that overview. And I in the last several months since we've been collaborating, I've learned a lot about the process. It used to be, as you said, there were places one could watch documentaries or a movie house, and recognizing that the places and distribution is just a bottleneck. Never mind the funding. There's like every step of the way has gotten squeezed even tighter to make these films, important films, a reality. So Ann, I'd like to chat with you about your experience in media capture, and I brought a visual for folks at home. For folks who aren't yet familiar or may recall, this was Ann's cartoon in 2025. I think January 2025 was when this all shook down, and it was
right.
Barely a year and a half ago.
And just so you know, that's a rough. It's not a final cartoon.
Right.
My most famous cartoon is a rough.
It is. So if you just explain your cartoon, the context, and how your experience of coming up against media capture.
Right. So I've worked I had worked quite a few years for the Washington Post creating editorial cartoons. I started in 2008. And then again, as you said, I quit, and it was actually January 3rd, 2025. So I was there quite a long time. And just to give you some kind of background about how editorial cartoonists work in this country, it depends on the publication, depends on your editor, but everybody has an editor. And that editor will approve or not approve a rough when he or she sees it. So my process was, all the cartoons that were published in the opinion section at the Washington Post were, you had to submit a rough, and it had to go to the editorial page editor. but we all had kind of in-between editors. So that's who I worked with directly. So anyway, my regular process was that I could choose the topic of my choice. I was never told what subject matter to draw. That was mine. I don't know what the other cartoonists had, but that was my ever since 2008. So I had been reading in various newspapers, as well as the Washington Post, a story about how after the election of Trump again, the second one, that all of a sudden all the tech oligarchs and the billionaire newspaper owners, mine included, decided that they were going to get in the good graces of Donald Trump. So they all made these pilgrimages to down to Mar-a-Lago. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. So I did this rough, saying, that's really not great. It's going to diminish the free press. And I didn't actually think the cartoon was that big of a deal. I mean, it's not really that pointed. It's just kind of illustrating what they're doing. And I got back a one-word response, no. And I'd never had that before. I mean, usually if there's a problem with it, I'll be told, oh, we don't really think it's very clear, or, an image, they're kind of uncomfortable with an image. And this particular editorial page editor was uncomfortable with a lot of different images. So I was always kind of navigating that, but I was never told I couldn't do the subject matter. So I asked, first through my direct editor, I said, well, why? And got all these reasons that surfaced later on in the press, one of them being that it was repetitious because another columnist had written about this. And I thought, oh, okay. So I went back and looked, and this columnist, Eugene Robinson, had written about, yes, them going down there. But the point was, the angle that he took was that Trump was going to stab them all in the back. He wasn't criticizing them for going down there. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to criticize these billionaire newspaper owners, but I wasn't allowed to do it. So to make a long story short, I mean, I had a phone conversation with the editorial page editor, and I just decided I couldn't continue. And I had not planned to quit. I had already been through the first election and the first presidential 4 years of Trump, and I was looking forward to not doing that. But once he was reelected, I knew that I had to. And like any other editorial cartoonist, we all get our feathers ruffled and we're like, we're going to do our best work ever. So I was all ready to go. So when I made the decision based on the fact that I knew I couldn't do my best work anymore, if they were going to tell me what I could and could not comment on, I knew I had to quit. So that's what I did.
Incredibly powerful action. As we talked about, people obeying in advance, people bowing in advance. I just want to, maybe I'll show it for people who haven't. I'm going to bring it a little closer because, and it was very prescient who you chose even. It wasn't just Jeff Bezos, but Sam Altman, Soon-Shiong, and Zuckerberg. And Disney has flopped. Maybe it's less flopping lately, but you chose. A year and a half ago, it wasn't clear the power that Sam Altman would have. What Soon-Shiong, he's destroyed the LA Times, hoping to take it private. Like these folks have, and he took it to the right and put AI in the LA Times, and like these folks have done really malevolent stuff towards the the American society and culture. So you captured some of the most ignominious players early on before we recognized how bad things were going to be.
Yeah, and understand that's why it was so surprising to me, is that why was this such a big deal? I mean, I was doing what I was always doing for all the years that I've been doing editorial cartoons. You comment on powerful people and institutions and you criticize them through satire. I've been doing that since 1992, and I thought this is different now. If they're and as we've seen, not that I knew this was going to happen, but as we've seen, the Post just went down very quickly in the opinion section. People left in droves because they were told they couldn't write about things, or their pieces were getting basically killed. So that's a difference. It's a difference between that and editing. So that I want people to understand that.
But we're coming up against another facet of media capture. It's not as if Jeff Bezos needed to send an email to David Shipley to can your cartoon.
Oh, no. Yeah, right? No, I'm sure, I'm almost positive he didn't see the cartoon.
Of course, right.
But yes, the editorial page editor, David Shipley, made a decision, based on what he thought should be in that paper, and that's a problem.
Yeah. A lot of positive comments in the chat, and thank you, Ann. I mean, that was a very early, stepping up and stepping forward and taking a leap that, as you've said in the past, you didn't know what the next step was. And for people who are not familiar, the position at the Washington Post that Ann had was the premier, most desirable editorial paid staff position for editorial cartoonists, of which there are only a handful, and to take a step and leap into the unknown. So powerful stuff, Ann. Thank you. Seth, I'll ask you to weigh in a little bit on media capture, specifically as it touches on press freedom. You mentioned a little bit about the Ellisons. Please take this opportunity to talk about how media capture and press freedom, we've talked about Ann, we've talked about Laura with the directors of independent films. Your thoughts?
Sure. Well, I see the media capture of corporate media as maybe a first phase of what hopefully is not to come. The conditions for media capture have been in place long before Trump. They just hadn't been triggered the way that Trump has. When you've got media corporations, conglomerates, that have far more lucrative business interests than the news, whether it be theme parks, movie studios, online retailers, whatever it may be, owned by people who don't really have news backgrounds and who have no particular dedication to First Amendment freedoms, it's quite predictable that they'll be willing to throw journalism under the bus in furtherance of their other business interests. I'm under no illusion that all of the media bigwigs of the past were perfectly moral and ethical people, but at the end of the day, their financial interests were aligned with a strong First Amendment. They benefited from a strong First Amendment, so they were incentivized to protect the First Amendment. When I practiced media law, which wasn't that long ago, I left the firm in 2022, it was unthinkable to settle a frivolous defamation case with a politician or with anyone. I remember sitting in, arbitrations where someone would say, they'd bring me the plaintiff's whole spiel and their opening offer, and they'd ask me my counter offer, and I'd say not a single penny. And they'd look at me like with this look of shock, like, well, but you're going to spend a single penny tomorrow to show up to court. Why not just settle? And it's like, because we don't settle. That's just not what we do. Media outlets fought secrecy. They went into court and fought secret court filings. I saw this week that the Washington Post, in a case against Trump Media, the Truth Social owner, agreed to Trump Media's request to seal a court filing and actually filed its own brief under seal only because Trump Media had essentially asked it to. I can't imagine ever filing a brief under seal at the request of a government-aligned company. So, this stuff is really bizarre. And then the Washington Post editorial board came out with an editorial opposed to cameras in the courtrooms. Newspapers are now coming out publicly against transparency. It's really bizarre stuff. But when I say it's step one, what I mean by that is this form of media capture cannot really rein in the independent media that does not have mergers and business interests and, financial relationships before the Department of Justice or before the Federal Communications Commission. So what I'm concerned about is how the administration seeks to rein those people in. And I think we're seeing that. We're seeing the attacks on nonprofits, the attempts to manufacture ways to go after nonprofits' tax-exempt status, criminalizing ideologies, calling anyone and everyone Antifa, expanding the definition of terrorism, expanding the definition of national security threat. to the point where those terms become almost meaningless. Anyone who dissent becomes terrorism. And, we can look at the Prairie Land case this week, where we saw someone get 30 years in prison for transporting a box of political pamphlets of anarchist zines. And the prosecution theory, of course, there is, well, he didn't just transport them, he transported them to conceal evidence that could be used against his wife, who attended a protest where a police officer was shot. Now, that begs the question, evidence of what? We're talking about political pamphlets that were written years, sometimes decades before this protest, before this shooting, that said nothing about the protest or the shooting. But in this world where ideology and terrorism are viewed as synonymous, those zines in prosecutors' warped minds constitute evidence of an ideology, and the ideology constitutes evidence of a crime, of conspiracy with someone else merely because they shared some common ideology. So we're starting to see the blueprint that goes well beyond corporate media capture and starts to silence voices where that kind of leverage might not be effective. And of course, we've been seeing it used against immigrant and non-citizen journalists from the very beginning. We've seen people snatched off the streets for writing an op-ed, but there's still plenty of other journalists who those tools aren't useful against. So the administration is moving on to further components of the plan to silence dissent.
Thank you for that kind of ominous foreshadowing and context. But yeah, that we did just, I think there are probably about 8 different subheading or subtitles to Democracy Under Siege, media capture, oligarch control, fascism, and I think we're touching on several of them today. And I know one of the subjects you two have been for decades now a strong advocate for press freedom, and around the world, editorial cartoonists are often the target of violence. We have not experienced that yet in the United States, and I think there's a recent event. And if you want to speak to kind of the global context and authoritarianism of how editorial cartoonists are sometimes literally in the crosshairs of authoritarianism in recent events.
Yeah, well, we actually just had a really troubling development, and it's only been about a week, where an exiled Russian cartoonist was killed in Poland, on the streets of Poland. And he was a very vocal critic of Putin. Now, they don't have, obviously, any evidence yet, so we have to wait and see. But as we all know, Putin has got a pretty bad track record about journalists and them disappearing and being assassinated and everything. And this guy was a big critic. He did some really great caricatures of Putin, criticizing him. And was killed in broad daylight after he had attended a protest, which, when I heard that, I immediately started thinking about the Charlie Hebdo murders. As you said, we haven't had it here yet, but just the fact that this now introduces potentially the government assassinating a critic of a head of state, that's troubling. I mean, editorial cartoonists throughout the world, they don't have First Amendment protections like we do. At least we still do. But usually they're thrown into jail, there have been that have been killed as well as attacked. But this one was, the fact that Putin might be behind it is very, very troubling to me, because that's starting something new again. We actually did have that in Syria back when there was a cartoonist that did a lot of criticism. Cartoons about what's his name, Assad. Yeah, and he got his hands broken by a bunch of thugs. Now, of course, they never proved directly, but you know what? Probably his supporters went after him. So, like I said, when I heard that was really troubling to me. So editorial cartoonists have always been kind of right on the front lines there, just because we do visual commentary, and it's very easy for everyone to understand it. It's quick, and not everybody reads columns that are criticizing leaders. And frankly, a lot of these autocrats, they're kind of happy that most of their population can't read or won't read. But you know what? Cartoons go all over the place. So we've always sort of been right there. And my colleagues overseas have suffered a lot for that.
I'd add a case I just remembered is Adam Ziglis at the Buffalo News actually last year did a cartoon depicting the Texas flood washing someone away with a MAGA hat, and the little sign said the government is the problem, and they had to cancel a fundraiser at the Buffalo News. So because there were threats of violence. So
all of us have gotten threats. I mean, it's kind of goes with the territory, but yes, you're right. And the fact that I think the thing that disturbs me more than that, just because, as I said, we all have gotten threats, is, that cartoon was perfectly okay. There was nothing wrong with it. But people get so offended. And also, frankly, with social media, when people start sharing stuff and making their own commentary about what the cartoon is about. I mean, I had the same thing happen with a Ted Cruz cartoon. That thing went all over the place. And, I can tell you a lot of people who didn't understand that cartoon. That's the problem with an image. It's the beauty of an image, but it's also the problem of an image.
I want to use this opportunity. There's a fantastic longer panel, multiple series that Ann did. We were an advocate of Matt of amplifying your work and making it tangible and not this digital. I don't know if this shows up on people's screens. And I don't know if you want to speak to this. I can certainly read it to people, but it's basically speaks to why we're talking about editorial cartoonists and First Amendment freedom.
Yeah. It's actually a piece I did in 2018. It's a multi-panel piece. I did it for a conference where we were trying to explain what an editorial cartoon was, because a lot of people hear the word cartoon and they just think it's something funny. But an editorial cartoon has a point. And I just wanted to explain to people, and you can find this online as well. But the last panel here that Milo is holding up, I just say, so if you see a country without editorial cartoonists, or one where they're not creating tough, pointed satire, because you can say that about our country sometimes, is there's not tough, pointed satire against politicians and policies, be aware, because a silenced cartoonist is an indicator of a very unhealthy environment for freedom of expression. I know this term has been used a lot, but, editorial cartoonists are like democracy's canary in a coal mine, because if you see one that's being silenced, you're going to have other people being silenced as well. And we kind of saw that with the Charlie Kirk murder is, remember, there were a lot of common everyday Americans that, they would go on social media and criticize him or just repost words he had said, and they were fired. That is kind of that's quite a development, that you can't just go ahead and say something in this country that has a First Amendment. You might not agree that it's tasteful. You might think it's tasteless, but you know what? The First Amendment protects that. As long as you're not threatening someone physically, you can say, things that people don't like to hear or think isn't appropriate to say. But then we had that issue happen, and even our vice president called for people to dox them and get them fired. That's quite a development.
I think there's something too about humor in this presidency, and I think we've all noticed that he does not do well with being made fun of. I mean, some people say that event where Obama was making fun of him at that correspondence dinner years ago was what got him to run, and that's what motivated this whole thing is that he hates being made fun of. And there's something about him being made fun of by comedians and by pundits, by editorial cartoonists. He just cannot take that. And to me, that says like that works, right? Like to me,
no autocrat. Every autocrat has a thin skin. I mean, you see throughout the world, the cartoonists that get in trouble, it's because they're making fun of autocrats.
Yeah.
I'm gonna highlight one of the larger media and democracy developments of our time. Seth touched on it. It's the takeover by the Ellisons, two individuals, of a huge piece of the media infrastructure of America. Paramount, and now making an effort to take over Warner Brothers. These are massive corporations that reach, and as Seth said, this isn't just about a business deal. In fact, it's far from it. This is a terrible business deal. They can't even pay for it. They need $79 billion in loans and guarantees from foreign countries to subsidize this takeover. Their goal is to change culture. It's something that isn't talked about enough. It's not just political. They're not just doing this to protect their allies and their own agenda. They are buying media companies to shape culture. We've seen it. The abomination on the White House lawn of the UFC as part of American Freedom 250. We might not think of UFC as culture, but it actually is it is a part of culture. And they're beginning to shape culture. And one of the reasons they want media is to shape culture, and politics is downstream of culture. They've been resentful of the liberal reality, democratized, pluralistic, inclusive goals of Hollywood past, and the means to control that. I'll get off my soapbox in a second, but I want to talk about this merger, but hear from two artists here, both Ann and Laura, is the possibility of shaping culture and really influencing people in ways that are even more nefarious than stepping on a cartoon or not allowing a documentary to run. I don't know if either Laura or Ann or Seth want to speak to the concept of it's not a coincidence they want media companies. It's not to run them as a business. It's to decide what films are being made instead of what isn't being made as well.
Well, just look at what they're spending money on. I mean, look at all the money that they have to raise to try and take, like you said, Seth, it's bad business. And yet look at what they're willing to do financially, the loss they're willing to take to be able to have this kind of influence, not just over CNN, but on films and television. Look at how desperate Trump is to be able to get certain type of entertainers to play his 250th, anniversary or his birthday on the front lawn. They know how important it is. They know how important artists are and how important fiction is as well to the enterprise of creating narrative, which allows us to make sense of our lives. Stories help us make sense of our lives. And if you are telling a certain type of story and offering a certain type of perspective, they know how powerful that is. They know how threatening it is, which is why they want to have more power over it. And I think that that's part of it. And then the news part of it and controlling the news is another part of it. And I think they kind of go hand in hand. This is how we understand our world around us and how we talk to other people about what we want our lives to look like and what kind of rights we want to have and how we're able to express ourselves as citizens. And if it didn't matter, they wouldn't be doing it. They wouldn't be as desperate. And I thought there was a great question in the chat in here that somebody asked about what State AG Banta is doing and what's still happening, because I think a lot of people have just given up on the merger and think it's fait accompli, but there's this huge movement right now to do everything that we can to block it. And I was wondering if Seth could say something about that.
Yeah, sure. And first I wanted to sort of get back to the culture question and just make a quick point. I think we need to look past, the UFC fight and past the Trump administration, because this isn't about the Trump administration. Another question in the comment is, after Trump is gone, do all of these captured media companies just sort of go back to reporting the news? Well, no, this wasn't a 3-year investment by the Ellisons, and the Ellisons might be flattering Trump while he's around, but they had interests much larger than MAGA and certainly much larger than UFC. These are people who are worth like $500 billion. And one thing that Larry Ellison, who is the major financier outside of the Gulf states of this deal, is particularly interested in, and I don't mean to sound alarmist, but in creating a dystopian surveillance state. He wants Oracle to be used to create, and these are basically his words paraphrased, I'm not embellishing at all. He wants Oracle to be at the center of a network of cameras, recorders, surveillance tools that will monitor every move of every citizen or every person. And in his words, that will create a world where citizens will be on their best behavior. That's his vision of the future and his vision of his company, Oracle, which is far more lucrative than Warner Brothers Discovery could ever conceive of being. So when you talk about influencing culture, how is he going to use that to get people comfortable with that future that he intends to bring about? Is he going to, it benefits him to have people worked up and hysterical about crime and about law and order so that they're willing to forfeit their rights in order to in order to submit to surveillance. It benefits him to have people riled up about wars and about building the national security state and benefiting weapons contractors. So the influence on culture goes far beyond this tacky stuff that Trump is into. It's a lot deeper and more serious than that. But you're right, Laura, the merger is not a done deal. State attorneys general under antitrust law have their own powers, despite that the federal government cleared the review of the merger over the advice of senior staffers at DOJ, over the advice of the people who had actually been reviewing the merger. Higher up stepped in and cleared it. State attorneys general can still investigate and can still block the merger. Rob Bonta in California has been sort of at the forefront of that. There's been reporting recently that Paramount is expecting he and other AGs will sue. And, I hope that is correct. And I hope that as important as the economic implications of the merger are and the cost it will have to jobs and to the film industry, I hope that Bonta is not distracted, assuming he does go forward, with settlement offers that will, guarantee theatrical distribution of a certain number of movies or that might mitigate some of the economic harm. That's important, but it doesn't solve the censorship problem. It doesn't solve the cultural harm that this merger will cause. We're also exploring other options. We happen to have shares in Paramount, and we as shareholders have remedies against corporate waste, against actions that are not in the interests of shareholders, like plunging a company into debt so that the owners can expand their personal influence, which we think is what's going on here, or like bribing a president to clear a merger. Illegality is not protected by the court's deference to business judgment. Everybody knows that the settlement of the case with CBS, the $16 million settlement, was a bribe being laundered through the courts by Trump and his FCC chair, Brendan Carr. 2 days after the money hit Trump's bank account, Brendan Carr cleared the merger. Bribery is illegal. And bribery does not only include monetary bribes. Bribery includes quid pro quos involving control of editorial content. Concession, there's a fairly expansive definition of what can be encompassed by bribery law. So that's another avenue we continue to explore. There are consumer fraud theories, consumer harm theories that plaintiffs might be able to pursue. As much as I hope Rob Bonta will do what he needs to do and will be joined by many other attorneys general, I don't think that people necessarily need to just wait on the sidelines for Rob Bonta or whoever it may be to act. There are measures people can take, particularly attorneys.
I'm gonna take that as a perfect cue. We're coming. Believe it or not, the time is flying by. We're going to cover maybe a couple more questions, and I'm going to just riff on Seth's points for a moment. There are things that we can do. This is democracy. Actually, there's the we the people, and somebody posted, there's more of us than there are of them. And the Media Democracy Project is a civic org, and we've created a list of actions that people should be talking about. People should be talking about the merger with their representatives. 33 congressional representatives in the state of California jointly filed a letter in support of Rob Bonta filing a lawsuit against this merger. Every aspect of the democratic system, people should be mobilized against this merger. We've seen how toxic media capture is, generally speaking, but in specifically media capture by oligarchs, and not even just a classic media capture sense. There is a lot more at risk here. Seth outlined some very, harrowing dystopian futures of what the Ellison master plan actually can be based on their history. So this needs to be part of our conversation. I would say the following, that we cannot, and we've watched this powerful film, we see all the failings of our democracy. It is under assault, it is under siege, but I do not believe we can vote our way back into a functional democracy. I do not believe we can just fix the Supreme Court by flicking a switch if Democrats take the Senate, the House, and the presidency. The entire media ecosystem of the right that they have built will absolutely destroy any efforts for meaningful change until we meaningfully make fighting for better media part of that fight. So we need to make this conversation part of your democracy work. It's not about just knocking on doors or mobilizing people to turn out the vote and sending text messages and postcards. The media fights are the fight. That to Seth's point, that even after the Trump administration ends, the infrastructure that they are building is going to be there. They're the next level. So media fights are that. And we're going to share our guide with you momentarily. And you didn't get a chance to answer, if you wanted to, about the culture question or the comment of media capture. I know you're if you want to speak to that or anything we've discussed thus far.
Well, I mean, in terms of the culture, yeah, I think that that's part of basically controlling people. I mean, I know that people don't like it when you bring up the Nazis, but, they had a whole system of making sure that people, they had a very famous rotating art exhibition called Degenerative Art, where they showed, frankly, artists that we now celebrate as being degenerate. And what they wanted to do was get all the German people on board, and all decide that this is not the culture we want. Religion comes into it too. I know that we didn't talk about that, but, I do think that religion is also driving this. A certain vision of the United States as being Christian, which that's not the way I was raised. I was raised that this is a welcoming of all religions or none. And, they're trying to change that as well. It also all factors into women's rights too. Women's rights, we hear all about trad wives now and these, these people that are spouting off that maybe women shouldn't have the right to vote anymore. I mean, we're just completely going backwards, and that's all tied into culture and religion. So.
Thank you. I'm looking at a lot of the questions and comments. A lot of this is there are fundamental failures in democracy. We've seen corrupted SCOTUS, and once again, I think that there's a common theme here that we hope that all our attendees this evening will realize, that we have to fix our information systems. I'd like to now turn it over to the panel. We're going to do around the horn of some suggestions of what people can do besides electoral work, besides voting. How can we support, potentially if it ties directly to your work, but Laura, for example, documentary filmmakers or even democracy writ large. This is your chance to, if you had minions who are going to go forth and be pro-democracy, what are your thoughts that people should be doing based on what we've been talking about?
Well, one of the reasons that we made the film about structural challenges to democracy is that it's really important that we amplify and uphold structural reform, and we start to mainstream that. Because in the past, that was looked at as kind of too radical, too crazy. Oh, the people want to change these things. It's like, we have to change these things. So there's some very common sense reforms that could happen for the Supreme Court, for instance, that are just not happening. And we really need to pressure our elected officials to uphold that kind of electoral reform, specifically for the Supreme Court, so that these changes can happen. Somebody was texting in the chat about the National Compact registration and the way that could be. Some people disagree about whether that's the right way to go or not. Elie Mystal would not agree with that. He thinks it's too risky, but there's a number of advocacy organizations that are talking about structural reform that we need to look at. there's some folks who were saying in the chat, we can't mess with the Constitution. Once you mess with it, it's too scary. I want to remind you that Norway changed its Constitution 600 times. And they did that so that they could catch up to a kind of human rights level of understanding basic human rights in our country. When we realize that we don't have the actual right to vote enshrined in our Constitution, that's a tip that there is change that's possible. So I've realized this is kind of larger thinking and pie in the sky and down the road. But when politicians are starting to speak about this and when policymakers are starting to speak about this, it's important that we really lean into trying to understand what kind of reforms they're advocating for and why, and not just continue to believe in this mythology that our Constitution is great, because there are some aspects of our Constitution that are fantastic, and there's other parts that could use some reworking.
Very, very cool context. Thank you, Laura. Ann, your thoughts on how people can engage in meaningful action in support of democracy, editorial cartoonists, and such?
Yeah, well, we've been talking obviously about media capture and corporate media being captured. Support independent journalism, because that's where everyone is going. You know, Substack, a lot of journalists that you recognize, that you read at the Washington Post, at the New York Times, they are there, but they need support. There's Patreon. There's just different things that people go look for those. Also in your local community, and I'll talk about editorial cartoons here specifically. If your local paper doesn't have an editorial cartoonist commenting on local subject matter, write a letter to the editor and say, why not? Because you should have one. They're very important. And that's a way to really support the art form as well as the individual editorial cartoonists. So yeah, I would just say independent journalism now, this is where we're going. And I just read a piece about, the whole reason that Orbán in Hungary, the prime minister who was recently voted out, how he captured journalism was he had his friends and his supporters buy out private media companies. The only reason that independent journalism survived was because those journalists that were laid off or had to leave, were forced out, started their own. And they kept the population, up to date on what was going on. They did the investigative reporting. They didn't get, obviously, any financial backing, just like Laura doesn't get, but they asked for donations from their readership, just like what we should be doing now. So that's what I would say.
That's great. Thank you. And we're going to share links, by the way, to your blog. We're going to talk about how we also support you and Laura in the film. And Seth, if you'll tell us kind of your thoughts, what people can be doing to engage, to defend press freedom and such.
Sure. Well, yeah, I'll certainly echo what Ann said about supporting your local and independent media. I know I've been pretty pessimistic in a lot of what I've said today, but there is an opportunity to come out of this with something better. Independent media is stepping up. Lots of journalists are doing really great work and rising to the moment. And if they are adequately supported, we might come out at the end of this not needing to worry about the future of, CNN or the Washington Post, because we've got better places to go get our news that have significant reach to actually make an impact. I'm defending CNN's rights and opposing the merger, not because I think CNN is that great. I'm not a fan. I'm not yearning for more Jake Tapper on my screen by any means. That's not the point here. The point is how much worse it can get, but also how much better it can get. So my hope is that Jake Tapper retains his right to do what he does, and I retain my right to not watch it and to instead subscribe to and support far better journalism that is being produced all over the place, but doesn't have the budget, doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the reach it needs. So yeah, first thing to do, support independent media, absolutely, and contribute to it. Write letters to the editor, write op-eds. Participate in there. Start your own Substack. I know not everyone has time and not everyone feels like they've got the writing talent they need to do that, and that's fine. But if you do, it's participate in the free press if you believe in it. It's open to everybody. The First Amendment wasn't for the institutional press. The institutional press didn't exist. The First Amendment was for really, pamphleteers, a lot like the people who wrote the stuff that Sanchez is going to sit in jail for a while for possessing. So participate in the free press. If you've got capacity, either as a lawyer or a plaintiff, to participate in litigation to challenge some of the nonsense we're seeing, that is a great way to fight back. The Supreme Court is one thing. It's compromised, as plenty of people in the chat have said, but a lot of the lower courts are fighting back. I wish they'd fight back more. I wish they'd start sanctioning people and holding people in contempt for this totally bogus arguments that are being made in the courts. But the Trump administration loses a whole lot of cases. This is not your grandparents' Department of Justice, where an indictment was essentially as good as a conviction. They are losing cases left and right. And people may not be aware that there are a lot of movement lawyers. There's a vast democracy defense infrastructure that is willing to bring cases for free or for cheap. So if you think you've got potential standing, for example, we're exploring potential litigation against Brendan Carr, the FCC. Contact me if you have in some way been impacted by Brendan Carr's censorship. If you are a broadcast journalist, a contributor to broadcast journalism, a broadcast licensee who has had to spend money on legal fees and compliance to deal with Brendan Carr and his nonsense, if your show has been censored or moved to an unfavorable time slot, whatever it may be, reach out. We're exploring that. I mentioned the shareholder stuff. If you're a shareholder, be an active shareholder. Public companies are bad in a number of ways, but at least theoretically, the purpose of public companies is to allow investors to participate in corporate governance. So, do that. You only need one share to file a shareholders derivative suit or to file a request for records. So there are lots of ways people can still get involved besides, voting harder. There are plenty of options out there. And of course, support nonprofit organizations that help do that work. When you're done subscribing to your local paper, if you've got some money left over, check out freedom.press or freedom.press/donate, and we will put your money to good use.
Well done. Fantastic list of actions and ways to engage. I think we're hearing clearly, number one, do more than vote, which is a mantra of mine. In terms of the Media and Democracy Project, right now we're recommending, we think the most important immediate action to engage with is to block the merger and to call state attorneys general. They need to be nudged. They are responsive. So just like if you've ever called your city council person about the parking meter that didn't work, or your representative about something, practice making media activism the concept of making your reps accountable to those actions. So secondly, the Media and Democracy Project, I'm going to plug, we have a 50-state local journalism directory of independent news outlets. So if you'd like to learn and support local, which is critical to democracy, our local journalism outlet. I think we're winding up. The time is about to end. I think maybe I'd just like to say thank you to Laura and Claire, the producers of the film, and for your contributions to the film. But to spend this time with us and share your insights into the fights that we have ahead of us, but also give us hope and inspiration by being leaders. And Seth, thank you for your insights and really mind-opening in terms of the number of actions we can take to support press freedom across the board. Don't know when the curtain closes, but we have a minute or two. Laura, maybe I'll give you, if you'd like, the last word on the film. It's wonderful. Well, how do people engage with the film? How about that?
Well, I've been putting some things in the chat, but for those who are listening and not following along as closely, democracyunderSiegeDoc.org is our website. We record conversations like this and post them there. We list calls to action there whenever we do conversations like this with pro-democracy groups. And so we encourage you to go check that out. You can join our mailing list where we share more activities like this, as well as calls to action by pro-democracy groups that we're working with on a number of issues. If you would like someone else to watch this film, you can gift it to somebody on Kinema. If you're part of a pro-democracy group and would like to have a screening like this with a group of your own, you can reach out to us from our website as well. We're happy to organize. We're doing things in, especially right now, we're focusing on purple communities and communities who are blue havens in red states in advance of National Voter Registration Day. To create community and collaboration. And the main point is to mobilize people into action. I think whatever kind of action you take is quite personal, and whatever your lane is, you need to find your lane. For some people, it's going to be protesting. For other people, it's going to become activist shareholders, like Seth has suggested. There's no lack of things to do right now. So we just have to choose what makes the most sense for us. And then I would always say, just please follow and pay for and watch and read independent media. We need your support more than ever right now. The pressure on arts communities and news communities, journalistic communities it's hard to overstate how tough it is right now. And so when you support people on Substack, when you watch independent films, when you read independent media and support those outlets, you are supporting voices that we need more than ever at this time.
Fantastic. Thank you all. And thank you for folks who attended and joined us this evening in this shared experience.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Break up big media, break up big tech, resist.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice night.